Hello and welcome, dear listeners, for another return of the Oddjob Pod. Please do put down your card game of Preferra. I know things are getting interesting, but it is 3 a.m. in the morning, and we've got an important mission for you. Yes, after the passing of Sean Connery, we thought it was only right to go back to where it all started for Bond on the big screen. This is unless you, of course, count David Niven's Casino Royale as canon, which, of course, I know that everybody does, indeed. We are going to be discussing Dr. No in this podcast. It's a film which we just haven't got round to, amazingly, given this is where it's all started. And yet we felt it was time to actually go back to the very start, where Bond completely started on the big screen, and give it the full Oddjob Pod assessment. So, as half-baked as usual. And joining me in, as per usual, is Terry DeFellin and Graham Sibley. Gentlemen, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Yes, extremely well. No pithy comeback today, however, unfortunately. Possibly due to the paucity of one-liners in Dr. No that haven't, given me enough inspiration.
I mean, there's a few bits of sardonic wit in there, if nothing else. And I have a few thoughts and feelings as well on the one-liners that we might come to in there. But first of all, let's just open with a very obvious question. And Graham, how enjoyable was it to rewatch Dr. No ahead of this?
It's always enjoyable to watch Dr. No, actually, I think. I often think that when I approach Dr. No, that it's not going to be as good as I think it's going to be, or there's going to be things in there that are just too problematic for me to enjoy, because there are so many things whenever you go back in Bond, and you don't have to go back that far before you start hitting on things that don't really sit well with modern audiences. But with Dr. No, even though this is a film that is approaching 60 years old now, this is from 1962, it still stands up. And it's I think it stands up as much as anything because it is so clearly a period piece now. And you see a lot of films and TV shows that try to ape this sort of era, that love this sort of era because of the style and everything else about it. The thing I think that Dr. No grabs me back in every time is from the opening shots. You hear it before you see it. That soundscape that comes about, that whole sort of like Forbidden Planet soundscape that you get in the gun barrel sequence. And those sort of sound effects come out throughout the later stages of the film as well. But for me, that just completely draws me in, takes me to a different time. And so I get completely into that zone. And so, yes, in short, yes, I did love it watching it again, and because there is so much to love in this film. Also, there's a lot of problems in the film, but yeah, key point, love it.
There are a lot of problems, and we will definitely be getting to the more problematic stuff. But Terry, I actually feel exactly the same. Graham's kind of summed me up that even though the credits aren't necessarily typically what we'd imagine Bond credits to be now when we think of them, there's just something about it that gets the sort of hairs on the back of your neck going for me. And you start getting drawn in, and then you've moved from the John Barry theme into the Three Blind Mice, and all of a sudden you've got an assassination. And yes, while we've seen it a lot of times now, back then, I can imagine watching this for the first time and being completely hooked. And it's an opening sequence. We talk a lot about Bond opening sequences, and obviously this one doesn't have a pre-credit sequence. But from almost the first moment in there, I don't know how you feel, but I get drawn in every single time.
Yeah, the credit sequence, although different in a way, is obviously Maurice Binder, so it is consistent. Moreover, Graham refers to the sound effects that the movie opens up with. It must have been, as you say, Gary, it must have been quite an experience to watch this movie for the very first time, particularly in cinemas in 1962. I imagine that it would have been more reminiscent of initially watching a science fiction film. And it's interesting because there is obviously Bond is grounded in what we could describe the real world, or perhaps we should say a sort of like fantasy equivalent thereof. But it is fantasy, and that maybe science fiction isn't entirely inappropriate. The opening sequences, the location, I think it works extremely well. The card game, the setup for that, and then the savagery, the violence. And at this point, there's no sort of like humor baked into this sequence anyway. There is humor in the film, but not at this point. And I would imagine that the cold-blooded murder of a man and a woman, and then I would imagine in particular a woman in 1962, would have been quite a shock, and so quite an entrance.
And Graham, how does the film stand up overall, watching it back? Yes, we'll probably come to some of the more problematic bits here and there, but as a film as a whole, how does this stand up when you put it up against all the rest of the Bond canon? How does this stand up by itself, ignoring the fact that it obviously starts spawning a lot of the themes and motifs that we become very familiar with Bond as we move through the years?
Well, of course, all it's got to go on is the books, and of course the creative input of the people that they bring in for the film. Of course, as the franchise goes on, you've got all the previous films that they can draw upon and expand upon, or just get rid of. You can see they've got things in there that are being used even to the films today. M's Office, for instance, in the latter Craig films, you've seen a hearkening back to that. So you've got things like that go all the way through. The introduction of the Major Boothroyd, the first Q there, although it's done in a completely different way, you can see that for me underlines the way that this is different from all the other Bond films. It's one thing that doesn't sit right. It's sort of like, well, he's not Q. This isn't really a Q scene. He's just giving him a gun. But you can see that this is the sort of seeds. These are the seeds being sown here for what is to come in future films. And you can see with the next two films, the progression is really rapid. You've got this film with Peter Burton, I think is the actor who plays Q in this one, and obviously you go on to the next one where you have regular Q comes in. Although he's not called Q, he's still called Major Boothroyd. So he's the first character to return with a different actor, but he's giving him more sort of like what we think of as gadgets. And then you go on to the next film, Goldfinger, and you've got the car with the ejector seat and the machine guns behind the indicators. So that's just one example of the way that the films escalate throughout those early films into what we think of as a Bond film and what we expect from a Bond film. But really, they get so much of it in this first one. So much of it is there. And you can tell that they get it right because there's so much of this is referred to in the pastiches and the parodies of it. They go back to Dr. No and they take bits out of it because it's got some of the most iconic stuff in there. Really, and no more than Ursula, but which we will discuss her at length, I'm sure, later. And if not, I'm getting out of it now.
I mean, Terry, I'll kind of follow on by that, and for me as well, there is. I think I always get surprised when I watch Dr. No, just how much has been really well established that you can watch it now, and it feels like it's just part of the canon. It's done a little bit differently, but it holds up as a film that actually you could probably insert it anywhere in the Bond canon, albeit updated a little bit depending on the era it's in. But it doesn't feel like it's had to work particularly hard to establish it. And other than a few things, such as it being, perhaps a little bit more taut and a little bit less flashy until you sort of get to the end, you know where you are with this franchise, and it's actually for me, it doesn't feel like it's hard to suddenly see how it evolves so quickly because of just how much they got right as what we know as Bond now, albeit they probably didn't know how much they'd got right until you look back on it. But there was an awful lot there which they just seemed to nail, and on a budget that is probably considerably less than Ken Adam had to play with on future films.
I think that the film had the wisdom, rather, of drawing from an extremely good James Bond book. Fleming's Dr. No is an excellent James Bond book. And I think that they benefited also from the choice of the fact that they only needed to do one location out in the Caribbean, obviously in Pinewood as well. But they didn't have to have James Bond jetting around the world, so that I think helped it. But also I think that because they relied on the Fleming James Bond universe in order to fill out this movie as well, they brought Felix Leiter in. They introduced Spectre, and I think that there was a degree of sort of like an understanding of a broader universe that was already coming in there, that as Fleming had already established, that I think perhaps helped. I mean, I watched the film. The last time I watched the film, I watched it to try and understand. I tried to imagine what it must have been like to have watched it for the first time. It's impossible, isn't it, really? But I mean, I did try and put myself in that position, and I would have felt quite reassured that I was sort of like in an established, nice, tight action genre movie. Maybe not necessarily a spy genre film. Those are fairly nascent genres at the time, but I would have felt that this would have been a very reassuring film, and I think that would have been refreshing to certain audiences as well.
And also, Terry, the look and feel and just the production design on there, it feels very much of its time, but it also feels very with a nod to the future as well. As you said, it's science fiction, but there's also a lot of groundedness in there that it's which is probably comes across with the way it looks and feels. It's futuristic, but feels like, and again, I'm trying to imagine it watching it for the first time in 62, but it also feels part of what I would imagine would have been the here and now.
Yeah, certainly. And to that you can thank Sid Kane, the art director, and Ken Adam, the production designer, who produced some produced some fantastic visuals for this movie on virtually no money whatsoever. But it was also made with a view that if it was a success, they were going to do more than one. I mean, they'd initially, tapped up Cary Grant for the role of Bond, but he said he could only do the one. And they had it in mind that they would, if it worked, that they would do movies of the other Fleming novels as well. So, I mean, like Sylvia Trench was initially brought in with the idea that she would, be Bond's girlfriend for 6 or 7 movies, and Lois Maxwell was brought in on the understanding that she'd be back, and I believe that was the case with Bernard Lee as well. So they knew that they were building a series of movies if this movie went well. And I think that also gave them the confidence to be able to sort of like set the movie up to sort of like say, this is a thing now. Get used to these. You're going to be seeing more of these movies, and it really shows. It is, go back to what Graham was saying earlier about the age of the movie. It is extraordinary that this movie's legacy still exists in 2015, shall we say, in the last movie. I mean, obviously we've got Maurice Binder's captions, but I would suggest to you that if you were to sit down and really, if you were like a proper film studies person and knew all of this stuff, I'm sure you'd look at elements of Dr. No, and you could probably draw a line through the movies to Spectre. And it's not just in terms of the more obvious stuff, and obviously the characters, and stuff like that. But in terms, even in the format of this movie is so enduring, and it's a testament to the fact that this movie has been able to set this template, some of which is still in use today and is likely to be used in the next film whenever we get to see it.
Yeah, there's a lot that is just consistent in there. It's not as if they had to take 2 or 3 films to establish what Bond was. It was there and straight in. And there's for me there's a big confidence about the film. There's almost a confidence that they knew what they were doing, and you can sense when you see a film on screen that you've got a crew behind it who feel like they're working on something good. You can really kind of feel that, and it comes through just with every element from the directing through to, as you said, Terry, the production design. And Graham, when you talk about confidence as well, you've got an actor who wasn't really that well known at the time, who carries off what is now an iconic role with a lot of panache, and really established the template going forward for what Bond should be. And we've spoken in other podcasts, when people say they want to get back to Bond, what they really mean is probably they want to get back to Connery in the very early films.
Yeah, quite. As Terry said, there was Cary Grant was lined up for this role. Cary Grant was actually Cubby Broccoli's best man at his wedding. And actually, I watched a film. I watched North by Northwest not long ago, which was made 3 years before this one, and you can see a hell of a lot of Dr. No in North by Northwest, and you can see where a lot of the crew were sort of aiming towards, thinking, if we can make a film like North by Northwest for pittance, which they did, then they'd be onto something good. And I think that's what they get, and I think that's what. There's nothing groundbreaking in this film, even at the time. It's just a really well made film, and it's a lot like Bond. Bond very rarely breaks new ground. It does little things that people that you'll start seeing in other films, but a lot of the time it's picking apart. It's being a magpie and actually doing that and bringing it out and bringing it to the franchise, and then giving it to people who are hungry for more. And that's what it really does well. But yeah, you're right. Connery does come into this role unfancied, really unknown, and just makes it his own. Apparently, a lot of the shaping of his role was done by the director Terence Young, who everyone described as being the embodiment of Bond. He was the guy in the Savile Row suits and and just incredibly cool, and just basically told Connery how to play it as well. And as well, it was Young who had a lot of his mates are in the film in these very suave roles as well. If you see like the old men in the club, most of them are Terence Young's mates. So that's part of it, and I think that's Terence Young's role in the whole franchise. It can't really be understated. I think it is very important, and I think it helps. It helps when you've got someone like Connery who will take direction like that, and actually, Young knew what you could get out of Connery and got it completely. So it's part of the whole thing that gives it such a good start. It gives Bond such a good start in life, and of course Connery just runs with it for the rest of the decade, and then it's picked up, played in a different way by more afterwards, and other actors as well.
It's interesting you should say more, because I mean, for me, this film, like, it is Connery, and Connery establishes it, and you have got that kind of grittiness and violence, but there's a few moments in there where I kind of stopped for a minute and went, I could see Moore delivering those lines, or I could see how Moore could actually have come in, and you could have put Moore into this film quite easily, which I don't think you could have done in a lot of other of the Connery films. But there's certain things, and the one that kind of springs to mind, or there's a couple of lines that spring to mind. One is where Ursula Andress' Honey Rider says that, you know, she killed somebody by putting a spider under the pillow, and he just goes, "Well, don't make a habit of it then." And then another one where he's seducing Miss Tarot, and goes, "I thought I was here to admire the view," and just the kind of loushness that comes up from it. And there are little bits within the whole film where you're like, this is where you could see that Connery Moore blending. And when people kind of talk about Roger Moore took it in a different direction, I watched this and went, no, I actually think he still took a lot of cues from where Dr. No started. He just played to his particular strengths rather than Connery, who could, you know, when the bits which had the just kind of the tautness and the seriousness and the violence, that's where probably Connery came in a bit more. I couldn't see more doing quite as well with the John McClane Die Hard style crawling through the pipes, which obviously is quite a few years away from there. But there's a lot of things, especially when you've kind of got some of those slower sequences. I can see a lot of the two actors sort of sitting side by side in this, which I don't think, certainly by the time you got to From Russia with Love, I don't think you could have put more into that movie. Really at all.
No, especially like the line when he shoots Dawson and says that's a Smith and Wesson and you've had your six. That's Connery. That's completely Connery. You can't imagine more delivering that line at all, can you? But you're right. There are lines in there. There are the yes, the one where he's when he's in a room and saying I thought we was here to admire the view. That is totally more, isn't it?
They adopted that kind of lighter touch, particularly because they were concerned about the sexual scenes would not do well with the censors and would not necessarily play well with some audiences. And they felt that by adding a little bit of a light touch to those situations, that it might sort of change the context, alter the context ever so slightly. And I think that was probably wise, because obviously they knew the contemporary audiences very well and understood people's sensibilities. And very skillfully done. And then, of course, yes, set a tone for the rest of the franchise, but one that was done more out of pragmatism rather than any kind of sort of artistic endeavour. And it was one that, yes, that they would use quite a lot on with Dear Old Roger. Just going back to what Graham was saying about North by Northwest, because that's a movie that preoccupied me for quite a long while. And I watched it obsessively for a little while, much earlier in life. And I became somewhat preoccupied with the idea that, wouldn't it have been great if Hitchcock had directed Dr. No with Cary Grant as James Bond? And I there's a counterfactual somewhere where that actually happens. There's a parallel universe where that happens. But I mean, it would have probably, the only difference is that it would have been lavishly expensive, because by this point Hitch was commanding huge budgets. And yet we may not have seen another one. We may have seen the only James Bond afterwards, because they may just like, well, we're not making a sequel to that, because or conceivably it might have been terrible because Hitch was not incapable of creating stinkers. So so it would have been a really, really interesting thing to do. But yeah, there's a lot about perhaps largely because of the color palette of the movie, but there's a lot of North by Northwest, I feel, in Dr. No. You could perhaps argue that it's actually just a cheap knockoff. If you wanted to be unkind, it's a cheap version of North by Northwest, or it could have been if it had been badly made.
I was going to ask, in terms of Bond as a whole, Terry, how much of a debt do you think Bond, Dr. No especially, but Bond as a franchise owes to Hitchcock?
I certainly think that Hitchcock's contribution to the spy film genre is fairly considerable, going all the way back to Foreign Correspondent. But I think more broadly, I think the spy genre owes Hitchcock a lot, and therefore I think Bond does as well. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Hitchcock movies were probably in the back of the minds of Fleming while writing those novels, and indeed obviously Broccoli and Saltzman and Terence Young and all of those guys. I mean, they would have been watching these movies. They were blockbusters. Everybody watched the Hitchcock movies. So I imagine that, yes, they owe quite a lot to him, although perhaps not directly. It would be interesting for somebody, and I'm sure maybe somebody has actually done some kind of attempt to sort of make some kind of link with Hitchcock and Bond. But it is a lost opportunity, I think, of the era. And I suspect it's probably because Bond, the movies, came along a little bit too late for Hitch. I think if they'd done a Bond film in the mid-1950s, I reckon Hitch might have been up for doing one. And that would have been something to behold, I think.
One of those questions, and it's fascinating as well, because when you now have got Sam Mendes, who is much more of a kind of auteur, sort of, rather than I mean, I think it's probably unfair to say that some of the Bond directors were kind of slightly more jobbing directors, but Mendes is probably one where you've got much more of a director who's been established, rather than one who is just known for doing great action films, or sort of doesn't really. You wouldn't necessarily go and say, I'm going to see a film by, I don't know, Michael Apted, who did The World Is Not Enough. You wouldn't have kind of gone and seen an action film. You're going to see a Bond film, but there's a bit that goes into there. Graham, just kind of going back as well to sort of talking about what we've established, and I feel it's only fair to come to you for this. Bond establishes this film very clearly with one very distinctive shot, establishes probably how the franchise is going to take its approach to female characters.
Yes. Yes, it does. Let's face it, if you cast Ursula Andress, and they did, then you may as well get your money's worth out of her. And they certainly do. The one thing I did find about this film, and I think it's the one thing that really, really dates it for me, is the fact that nearly all the female actresses in this film are voiced by one person. And they're nearly all voiced by Nikki van der Zyl. And she does the voice for Honey Rider. She does the voice for Sylvia Trench, and I think she also does the voice of Annabelle Chung, the photographer in the bar. So they've all got this slightly Germanic voice, this very clipped, slightly Germanic accent, which is pretty much the same voice, and so they're all talking the same, which sort of lends it becomes this sort of background blur almost. I mean, she does it really well, and the actresses involved do their roles really well. But it just disappoints me because I remember seeing one of the extra things on the DVD, which has Marguerite Lavoie, who played the photographer. And she's got this lovely Jamaican accent. Actually, really, really lovely, mellifluous tones that she's got there. And you just think, this is perfect for a film set in Jamaica. But of course, she's actually done up, and she's actually given the name Annabelle Chung. So she's actually this Jamaican girl who is actually meant to be playing some Asian woman. I don't know, but it doesn't. That's not, of course, it doesn't explain that. So yeah, that's one thing I think that the film fails on, but that's part of when it was made. They obviously they obviously didn't like too strong accents in films, but I don't know why Eunice Gayson's voice wasn't used. But yeah, obviously it sets the tone, and every Bond girl that's followed has had to be measured up against Ursula Andress. And so when they say, "Oh well, how are you going to play your Bond? How is this Bond's going to be?" They never ask the actresses, "Well, are you going to play it like Ursula Andress? Can we expect you to see you coming out of the sea in a bikini carrying a couple of shells?" Well, yeah, probably not unless you're Halle Berry, but you know.
I think you sort of put it into nicely a little bit of a segue into the fact that this can be a slightly problematic film. Although, Terry, I actually found this probably less problematic to watch than I did Octopussy.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking, oh God, yeah, how terrible is this going to be? You know, in terms of sort of like the portrayal of women. I do obviously the sort of like evening out of the accents of different actresses is like sort of like gives you perhaps a kind of idea of what the producers kind of think of women in general, that they can just sort of like have, you know, that's fine, we'll just use the same actress, it's no problem. You know, they'd never dream of doing something like that with male characters, even, you know, sort of like, you know, supporting male characters. For me, the one that always leaps out is Bond and Miss Tarot.
Oh yeah.
Which just really makes me feel quite uncomfortable, you know, every time I watch the scenes that those two have. And it's pretty clear to me that you know, Miss Tarot is being coerced into having sex with this man, and not necessarily in a kind of king and country doing it for the fatherland or the motherland, or doing it for state or for a broader political purpose. You know, I'm a Russian agent and I'm with orders to seduce you kind of way. in a kind of, I work for the bad guys, but I'm the bad guy's secretary, and now I'm told I have to shag this guy, and he could possibly kill me because he's a murderous secret agent, and I just think that sequence just don't go well for me. At the same time, and I don't know, you could judge me how you like, they are difficult scenes to not watch. They're magnetic. There's great chemistry between the two of those characters.
I'd have to disagree with you there. I think it is easy to look at that scene and think, oh, like she's the victim here, but you could also see is like she's luring him to his death, and she has to think on her feet. She doesn't expect him to arrive because she thinks he's going to be dead, and so I think he actually plays it really well. They know that they're on opposite sides. There is this unspoken thing. You can hear her on the phone, like, so keep him busy for 2 hours. So basically, just you're there to distract him. And this is the theme that goes throughout the whole film. This is throughout the whole run of films, is the fact that both sides know what they're doing, and in many times the woman is there to either aid his death or to kill him herself. No one is an innocent victim in this film, I don't think, apart from, well, is the secretary in the opening scene? No, well, she's not. She's working for British intelligence as well. So people die in this film, and because they're women, doesn't mean to say that they are less worthy of being killed. Yeah, it is tough because they are obviously, all the women in the film are subordinates to someone. They don't have a lot of agency there. They're all just reacting to what's going on around. But then again, most of the male characters are like that as well.
I'm not attempting to make a general case about the portrayal of women in capitalized letters, but I mean, I think for me, she for me is someone who is being asked to do far more than really is above her grade. And let's include that does indeed include, luring someone to a death. I think that the phone conversations for me are the tell, where she's extremely concerned, I would say frightened, about what is happening and what is going to happen, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. But not necessarily in a way that I'm supposed to feel uncomfortable because it's drama. But I take your point. I mean, yes, I mean she's definitely did sign up to work for the bad guys, and so there is a degree of risk involved in that kind of thing. And it's not like she was killed either. She was taken away by the police. So.
Yeah, I think if you balance that up against the driver that picks up Bond from the airport, I suppose that shows you another lackey. Basically, all he was meant to do was delivering him, and then all of a sudden he's taking a cyanide pill. So they're obviously the lackeys are willing to put their lives down on the line, and I suppose that gives you the impression of how much fear these put into the members of the organisation, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean that this establishes the menace of Dr. No, I think, really, really well, because that's established right from the beginning. Because even though we don't know anything about this movie or what's going to happen in this movie, two people are brutally gunned down in cold blood in the first sort of like 2 minutes of the movie. And that certainly, and yet as the movie progresses, it's becoming very clear that people would rather die and indeed take their own lives than face the wrath of Dr. No. And this sets things up really, really nicely, and is one of the movie's great strengths. You need that kind of stuff to be able to build in the audience the necessary trepidation about the eventual encounter with this person, whoever they are.
Yeah, well, Graham, let's talk then about Dr. No, the eponymous Dr. No, and Joseph Wiseman's portrayal. And again, there are problematic elements into here, but also one of the elements that I just enjoyed that Terry's touched on perfectly is just how good an idea for a villain is, because I can imagine watching this for the first time, and the fact that you barely see Dr. No until the final reels is genuinely quite unsettling all the way through. And then when you finally see him, yes, now you probably might create the character a little bit differently, but there's just a real sense of menace in that dinner scene between Bond and No.
totally. The first scene that you're really introduced to No is the bit where Dawson gives his evidence to him. Where he comes into the room. There's just one chair in the corner. There's that lovely skylight that is shining down in there as well. It's a beautiful space, but it's really sinister. And the voice just cuts through, doesn't it? It's almost like harkening back to the sort of like old Universal picks, isn't it? That sort of like style and sound to it as well. The timbre to his voice, but it's so flat. But the real skill that he brings to it, that Wiseman brings, is the amount he can bring across in such a monotone voice. And it is perfect. He was a stage actor primarily, and that's where he always wanted to describe himself as. And I can imagine that he would have been absolutely spellbinding to see him live on stage, delivering lines like that. And yes, it is difficult for a Westerner, but to play someone who's half German, half Asian, and okay, so they get him in. It's 1962. Okay, we've got to go with that. I mean, we've got Zena Marshall, who is playing Miss Tarot, who's also meant to be Asian, and then we've already explained about other roles as well. They don't really care back then about as far as that's concerned. But I think for what we get from Wiseman is just a really, really well played villain, and he exudes menace. And yes, when they sit down to dinner, it is just all about the menace, because he comes across, when he starts coming off across, it seems really weird now, because those scenes have been, here we go with have you got the bell ready, Terry? We've got to do our Austin Powers reference now. But there he is. He's giving it the full Dr. Evil, isn't he, at the table? And especially now, I mean, like, those films are 20, 25 years old now, and so they're ingrained into our brains. And so that's one thing is I can watch this and take it seriously. I wondered just whether or not anyone who has only ever seen the Craig films at the cinema and comes and sees Dr. No and thinks, is this bad guy for real? But they're still drawing upon him now. They're still drawing upon him. Christoph Waltz. You look at those scenes in his lair. It's all Dr. No, isn't it?
The obvious physical deformity, the Nehru collar, the desire to explain your plans and tell your backstory, so much of this endures and did endure throughout the franchise and returned. I mean, I think during the 1970s and 80s it got a little bit cheesy and they tried to move away from it, but not much, frankly. And they rejoiced in it positively when they brought in Christoph Waltz to play Blofeld, because, I mean, let's face it, sort of like Dr. No in terms of the movies is a proto Blofeld. I mean, this is where they were going with this guy. If they decided to keep Dr. No alive, the character alive, then it might well be that he would have continued on that way. But in effect, he turned into Blofeld. And Wiseman's portrayal is definitive, absolutely definitive. He is the original James Bond movie villain, and I know that's a stupid thing to say because it's the first film, but it needn't necessarily have been that way. Dr. No could have been a different film. In many ways, it is different to the other James Bond films. It's not settled upon its format quite yet, but one of the things that does stick from the outset is the James Bond villain, and they are still doing those James Bond villains to this day, which is absolutely extraordinary. What can you say about the fact that he is portrayed as a half Asian character? I think that what you can say is that they really shouldn't do something like that now, and they probably shouldn't have done something like that then, but they did. And the choice that we have to make is to enjoy it or not enjoy it. And I choose to enjoy it.
I mean, I found watching Dr. No that I almost felt that I needed to go back to our World Cup of Bond villains and potentially reassess where he sat in there, because by the end of it, I was like, this guy, I'd forgotten just how genuinely creepy he was, and also how much he had the upper hand over Bond, which not all of the villains you necessarily think do. Yes, no pun intended there.
That's a bit of an insensitive remark, actually, Gary.
I withdraw my comments. But yeah, you take, and I'll take sort of a random villain here. There's a few of them where, certainly probably in the Moore era, that you don't always get the sense that they're quite that step ahead of Bond that they think they are. Whereas here, actually, this was, when he makes that comment that you're just a stupid policeman. There's actually, and I know I kind of referenced John McClane. There is almost a bit of a kind of the line that you can draw through to there, because Connery at this stage, Bond at this stage, is having to think on his feet, and he's not this kind of. Up to then, he'd been very comfortable in his world of espionage and spying, and you got the sense he was in control. And then at the point when he was captured, which happens a lot, but a lot of the later films, because he's Bond, he's going to get out of it. Whereas this one, what he's doing is not a million miles away from Bruce Willis suddenly realizing that he can get a machine gun and just thinking on his feet. You can obviously tell it's Christmas just after we recorded this, because I've watched all the Die Hard movies. But yeah,
just a quick few remarks, if I may, about that scene, because let's just also consider this, because Graham has rightfully filled us with great deal of praise for Joseph Wiseman and his acting ability, but let's just also consider that scene, because one of the reasons why that scene is so special is also because of Connery's role in that as well, and he carries that off, and that biplay and that interchange extremely well and extremely effectively. And this is by no means A-lister leading man Sean Connery at this point. This is guy who had numerous bit parts or had played supporting roles, albeit extremely well, it should be said, in other movies, but was not necessarily the kind of guy who you would expect to pull off that kind of role very well. And he did it definitively. And to your point, your Die Hard point, although he succeeds. If we go in universe here, Bond succeeds in convincing Dr. No that he is a stupid policeman, because Bond is not a stupid policeman. He's a 00 agent. He's at the top of his game. He's the best, of the British agents. He's clever. He's resourceful, and he's prepared to take a kicking in order to get himself out of a situation and then into a new situation where he can then change it. And the first thing he does when he wakes up is he escapes. He gets the hell out of there. Now, obviously, it's because run times of movies, and you don't want to have him walking around figuring out what to do. But this is the level of creativity and dynamism that the character has and that Bond has, and these are also very, very important scenes, because we again get to understand and appreciate the kind of character and kind of person that James Bond is. And Sean Connery has everything to do with making that work, along with obviously the fantastic sets and brilliant direction. But you know what I mean.
Yeah, Graham. I think that's a nice kind of way to take it into talking something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is how things could potentially have been different. And we talk about Bond films when we know that they've hooked it up well, and we know that when it's established early on, there's just something about a good Bond film where you can start seeing everything clicking very, very quickly, and it doesn't let up at all. And it would only take one miscasting or one sort of plot direction that can sometimes just take the film off in a slightly wrong direction, or the writers lose their sense of tone. And I think for me, and I don't know how you feel, but this is one of the things I enjoyed again when watching Dr. No, is that this is a film where everybody feels incredibly focused. Everything is there, and all the decisions are right. And sometimes it's probably luck that it's aligned. I mean, it could have been, as we've said, it could have been a very different film if you'd had Cary Grant in the lead role. But unlike some Bond films, this genuinely kind of holds together, and it doesn't try to deviate. It knows what it is from the minute that it starts to the minute that it ends. And that's the good template that all other Bond films have followed, not just for the fact of, we've got the girl, we've got the villains there, explaining plan, Bond captured, etc., etc. It's a film that knows what it wants to be, which you can't always say that for other films in the franchise.
No, exactly. I think that's one thing that you find, one of the most enduring things about Bond is the fact that it's got so many good people who bring so much to it. And if you say, well, we've spoken this, we've had a couple of podcasts about the DNA of a Bond film, about what runs through them all. And a lot of the time it is because you've got the John Barry music, or you've got the Ken Adams set design, of the Maurice Binder credits, and all those sort of things, the names that keep coming over and over and over again. Of course, this is the first one, so you don't have that legacy there, but you've got people there who are, and who know, who aren't exactly known. They're not unknown, but they're not A-listers. They're not stellars, are they? But what you've got here is you've got people who are pretty much been promoted in this film. Sean Connery's been promoted. Ursula Andress was pretty much only a model really when she got this, and so all these you're going up a couple of levels, and they're bringing their A game to it, and so, and call it magic, call it good choices in casting and recruitment, but it all turns out into something that is really good. Yes, there are problems with this film. Yes, it's a bit cheap. Yes, the end is probably its weakest point in the film, and there are things that haven't aged well in it. But really, going back to the first question you asked me about how this stands the test of time, and I think what we've talked about so far has proved it, is the fact that it's just a really well made film. And in fact, even though I think the ending is a little bit weak, it's quite truncated, and so it gives you a lot more time on the island with Bond and Ursula, which are great scenes, because there's great chemistry there. Absolutely great chemistry. And you've got the first half of the film, which is good spy film. It is about Bond and Felix and going around Jamaica and like finding out what's going on. And so essentially the whole film just has so much to offer. And I think that's the best thing about Dr. No. It's the biggest praise I think I can give Dr. No, is the fact that there is so much of interest in this film, but it doesn't feel like they've thrown the kitchen sink into it. It's varied, even though it's basically just one location. It's not one location, but effectively it's one location. It's not him just jetting around the world just for the sake of jetting around the world. This is an operation. It's in Jamaica because that's where it happens. And the story is great.
It's interesting that you talk about the spy element as well, which I think is the last bit that we probably should touch on in here. And Terry, I've talked about Bond's potential legacy into action genre, such as, trace a line into Die Hard. We can see the parody in Austin Powers as well, and we've talked about how Bond has taken a lot of the kind of masterful DNA from Hitchcock as well, and the kind of elements that come into that. But also watching this film, it's not the quickest film all the way through. It's actually, the bits in the middle are quite a sort of taut spy thriller. And again, you can see the influence Bond has had on the spy genre. If you take out the kind of slightly more big action set pieces, actually, there's a lot of Dr. No, which you can take through into perhaps some slightly slower, quieter, more kind of hard-boiled spy thrillers that follow.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's an aspect, I think, of of Bond that we might see a bit more. I think our next podcast is going to be from Russia with Love, so we can perhaps explore that aspect of it a little bit more there as well. But yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm not really sure about my spy film timeline and to what extent it really is groundbreaking in that area. But I certainly agree with you that what it does is it gives license, I think, to other filmmakers to say, "Oh, well, we should make movies like this." I mean, I'm a big fan, as I'm sure you both know, of the Ipcress File. It's my actually officially my favourite movie. And although there are times when it's not, but you know what I mean. It is officially. It's the one I take with me to my desert island, full of beautiful women.
Full of Ursula Andress.
Full of yes, indeed. Anyway, where was I? Yes, sorry. Beautiful women. Yeah, no. So, and I suppose you could possibly, given that was a Harry Saltzman production as well, you could possibly draw a bit of a line from Dr. No to there in those early stages. I'm not so sure, but I mean, I don't think the movie doesn't. It's not like Die Another Day. It's not this kind of spy thriller, and then suddenly becomes another movie, sort of like halfway through or 3/4 of the way through. It moves quite nicely, and it grows in. It becomes more grand and more ambitious in scope. I think quite naturally, and it works quite nicely. I think the move to Crag Key gets them out of that thing and gently introduces us into what is a very different other part of the film, which again is still more formulaically Bond. And those sequences on Crab Key and Dr. No's lair are really, really quite spectacular. I know we don't necessarily like the actual final sequence because it's a bit low rent. It's the cheapest underground complex. It's not exactly You Only Live Twice, but it's the germination of You Only Live Twice. You Only Live Twice is like
Totally.
Ken Adams gone. One day I'm going to be able to build one of these things inside a volcano, and it's going to be fucking awesome.
You could just tell those were his side notes on when he was drawing up the plans for this. So, yeah, next time volcano.
You can kind of imagine him going to like Broccoli and Saltzman and Terence Young. And go, okay, so right, guys, I've got this plan, and it's a volcano, and you can just see probably Cubby Broccoli go, no. You've got $1 million, and that's your budget.
They go, Ken, I love your idea, but would you just follow me for a moment? They take him round the back, and they take him to an outhouse and say, right, that's what it is, okay? Off you go.
Do your
It's
best.
a garage. I like the that final sequence, but I like it because I appreciate the hard work that's been put into it. I don't necessarily like it because it's good. I like it because I really got a lot of respect for the people who put it together. I love the little miniature boats and stuff like that. I think they're really dinky and funny and nice. But for me, I don't think it doesn't check you out of the film, though.
No.
In my opinion, I reckon that there are going to be younger Bond fans who will watch this and say, "Look, I'm not having this. This is just too low rent, and I'm not going to have it." And I totally respect that. I always respect the wrong opinions of younger James Bond fans, but I think, I don't feel for myself that those moments check you out of the movie at all. And I have to say, when I watched it the last time for this, it's probably the most fun I've had ever watching Dr. No, because I have allowed myself to get hung up on its various other problems and foibles and shortcomings in the past. And I've decided to put them all to one side and just try and enjoy this movie for what it was. And in fairness, it's been quite a long time since I've seen it, so there were some sequences that I'd actually completely forgotten about. It's probably my least watched James Bond film because it is a bit rough around the edges and it is a bit cheap. And there'll always be another movie that I think I'd rather watch instead if I was going to watch a James Bond film. But having said that, I will certainly be rewatching it again very, very soon and enjoying it.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was. I think I get this every time I watch Dr. No, that I just forget how much I enjoy the film. And there's some Bond films that I think I enjoy more than I do, and when I get to watch them, I'm like, okay, it probably isn't as good as I remember, but there's bits that I genuinely love in it. And there's some Bond films where actually you watch and you reappraise, and then there's some where for people who've been listening to us for quite a while may remember the enthusiasm that we entered into the director's commentary for The World Is Not Enough, and how we ended that as well, how it started, how it ended, which I don't necessarily recommend you do, although, a lot of people are in lockdown, so, take your pick. You've got a couple of hours to sit and watch The World Is Not Enough and listen to us slowly lose the will to live. But as a whole, and I think this is kind of a good point to start sort of bringing in the conclusions. Graham, at the start, I kind of asked you how this film held up today. Just kind of shifting that a little bit, and after our discussion, how does this film hold up overall in the Bond canon? And I know it's a really difficult question because it's the first one. It sets the template, but when you take it on its own merit as a movie that you sit down and watch, and if you're like certain nerds, you kind of sit down and you mentally rank which ones you prefer and which ones you wouldn't. And Terry had sort of said, it's one of his least watched ones because of X, Y, Z, although, now we'll probably go back into it a bit more. Overall, as a kind of film within Bond, how does this stand up? Is it one where you probably would go, perhaps it is a bit too low rent, and I might come back to it from time to time if it's on TV, or, I'm just sat there going, I haven't watched it in a while, I probably should. Or after this, if you kind of going, you know what, I really enjoy it, and I'd happily sit down and watch it again tomorrow if somebody gave me a choice of a few Bond films.
Well, having just watched it, I probably wouldn't watch it tomorrow. But yeah, it is something that it is a film that I probably haven't reassessed as dramatically as Terry has, but it is a film that I have more time for. But then I've just done a whole rewatch of the whole of the whole all 24 of the films, and I thought that of quite a few of them. And when we went through all the more films as well, there were films that I thought, I never watched this film. There's got to be a reason why I don't watch this film. And then when I watched them, I think, actually no, I really enjoyed that. I can see why I used to love that film, and there is no reason why I shouldn't love it now. And there are some films which I love even more because I'm analysing them more, because I know I'm going to talk about them for an hour or so on this podcast. And then also as well, I watch other films that I think, no, I love this even more because now I'm going to convince Gary that he loves it too. I'm really glad I don't have to convince you, Gary, that this film is a good one. In the canon itself, it's mid-table. It's certainly not in danger of being relegated, but let's face it, Europa League is just a pipe dream for them, put it that way.
I would go along with that. I mean, I don't think I've ever needed any convincing that Dr. No is an enjoyable film. I remember, watching it. I don't know whether it was the first time, but I do kind of, I remember watching Dr. No and coming away with very fond memories. Even though I'd watched a lot of other Bond films beforehand, I remember coming away first time and going, this was a good film. This was a film that I thoroughly enjoyed sitting down, and it held my attention and it was enjoyable. I'm probably doing a massive disservice. It is a better film than For Your Eyes Only, but I kind of had the very similar attitude to it, that I sat down with For Your Eyes Only when we did it recently for the podcast, and went, this is a very enjoyable use of 2 hours. And I feel the same for Dr. No. Different reasons, and it's a very different film, and I think it is a better film. But that kind of still, Terry, for me, that was still my prevailing attitude. As Graham said, for me, it's a mid-table film. But equally, you come away and you don't feel like you've wasted any time, and you come away with a little bit of a feeling of joy, and you've had a good evening if you sat down and watched Dr. No.
Yeah, it doesn't have the squad depth for Europa League, so I think it's comfortable. There was a time, I think, in my Bond life in which I probably would have found this film quite difficult to watch, and did find this film quite difficult to watch. and consequently gave it quite a bit of a break over time. But I think possibly because I know, or I've probably developed a better appreciation of film in general, and I've come to appreciate the movie's technical qualities a great deal, and I think, as I've alluded to earlier, I've come to appreciate Sean Connery's qualities, and indeed Joseph Reisman. And I always remember watching the scene between Connery and Ursula Andress, as well. And like when she was giving us her backstory and just like how well that was. And I just thought again, tremendous chemistry. And there's a link here, and it's Connery's, because he just links up so well with his supporting actors and actresses, and did so throughout his entire career. And it's gratifying to sort of like see, that happening in what is his first major role, and just how easy and natural it is. And I don't think that you can, understate that. I mean, the film, could well conceivably have been lost. They were, in many ways, they were possibly lucky to have been able to have cast him. Could have got that wrong and cast somebody who was no good, and that would have been the end of it. But I mean, in broader points, I mean, I think it would probably be remiss, I think, for us to not, give some kind of homage to John Kitzmiller, who plays Quarrel in this film, which is another, I'd have to say, problematic element to this, because it is sadly another example of the trope of the black character being killed off. But it also, in defence, it is also another first example of the trope of Bond's best or closest henchman, who isn't Felix Leiter, who usually ends up either burned to death or dead in a dumpster, or hanging by his legs of a piece, in Switzerland. It's something that happens to people who hook up with James Bond, and I think that, but I thought that Quarrel was absolutely superb character. Again, you can, and people will make criticisms of his portrayal and the fact that he was perhaps overly superstitious, and that perhaps this is a negative portrayal of people of colour. I would suspect that that's a conversation to be had perhaps more learned people than ourselves. But nevertheless, I found it an extremely enjoyable character, extremely watchable, very convincing, and genuinely saddened when he met his gruesome end, I have to say, all over again. I mean, that's the thing about watching a movie for the first time in a long time, is that you kind of know what's going to happen, but sometimes you're not always completely prepared for the emotional reaction that you're going to get from it. It's nice. And again, that's the other thing about this movie is that it elicits emotions from you. And sometimes James Bond films don't do that. Sometimes James Bond films, you watch them and then they wash over you and you think, oh, that's really cool. Oh, that was a great line. Oh, that's a great stunt. Oh, that's really cool what he did there. But you don't necessarily feel emotionally, engaged. There's an element of viscerality that to Dr. No that other movies, technically speaking, better James Bond movies just don't have. And I'd place even quite recent James Bond films in that respect. So I think actually it ranks pretty highly. I wouldn't want to actually put it, but I think mid-table is right, but maybe upper mid-table.
Yeah, I have exactly the same feelings. I probably would imagine I had the same feelings that you had at Quarrel's death as well. I was kind of almost a little bit unprepared for how much I just went, oh, that gets you, because he is, and again, testament to how well the character is played. And yes, there's problems with it, but also that you've bought into this character. He is a great addition to that cast as a whole, and I completely agree. It has more emotional heft than potentially you might give Bond credit for. Feels like we've kind of come into there, and we've obviously kind of wrapped up to a certain extent, but given that we went through the Moors, now we're going through the Shawns, and I don't, we sometimes approach some Bond films a little bit of questioning and trepidation, but on this one, I'm just going to go, how much are you two looking forward to doing From Russia with Love for our next podcast?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No,
it's the world. it's the world champion, isn't it? World champion.
Yeah, but this is
From
the
Russia
worst
with
thing,
Love.
though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are we going to watch it and go, oh, crap, no, this is awful. Oh, my God. No.
Do you know what I think? Do you know what I think is going to happen, guys? And we may well be quite old men by the time we get around to this. But by the time we've done all of the Bond films, so if we do the Connery ones,
Yeah.
and then maybe we start to reevaluate Pierce and Tim and Daniel, and we end up doing the whole thing, we might have to do another World Cup.
I'm intrigued by this. I think let's face it, we were in a certain mindset when we did the first World Cup.
Hang on, guys, hasn't it been 4 years? Isn't it 4 years this year?
It is 4 years. It will be 4 years since the World Cup.
Well, what's being suggested here? I don't know what's being suggested here. Okay. Well, summer is nearly coming, and let's face it, we're still going to be in lockdown.
Please let it come.
Yeah. So, okay, all right then. Well, let's resolve to do another World Cup then.
Be interesting to see what the results are when we haven't finished off about 3 bottles of port before recording the podcast.
I can't believe another Bond film hasn't come out since then.
Oh no, it's so sad. So sad. Well, hopefully, maybe what we could do is we could do another World Cup then in the summertime, but on the understanding that No Time to Die is out.
Yeah.
Which I think is still, I'd say that was still up for grabs, personally. I don't think that's a thing. But to your point, no, gosh, From Russia with Love, I can't wait. I'm half a mind to go downstairs and watch it right now.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that we will watch the shit out of that film. And with that, hopefully, listeners who come on journey, there may be some of you who haven't seen From Russia with Love and are new to Bond, in which case this is a treat for you. And there may be some of you who do not, necessarily share our opinion of From Russia with Love. We respect that. You're wrong. Go and watch it. Listen to our next podcast, and we'll tell you just exactly how much you're wrong. And I think, I know that I am frequently accused of being wrong in my opinions of Moonraker, but anybody who has an opinion that From Russia with Love is not a good film is going to be more wrong than that, in my opinion.
Do you want me to come along and pretend that I don't like it and just completely be just contrarian, just for the sake of it? Yeah?
Contrarian Twitter angry angry man.
Yeah, if you want me to, I can do that. I can switch that on whenever you like.
Yeah, it's a pretty poor grift, to be honest with you.
It's 2021, Terry. Come on.
Yeah, we really are scraping the bottom of the barrel of grifts. It's got to be said.
We've got to all get our kicks from somewhere. But yes, our next podcast will be From Russia with Love. I think we've gone through Dr. No, and not that I didn't like this film, but I feel we've all had a reappraisal of it, and it's just enjoyable fun. So if you're with problems in it, but if you're going to watch a Bond film, you could do an awful lot worse. As I said, next podcast is From Russia with Love, of which hopefully we are not going to come away and feel like we did when we did our World Is Not Enough podcast. Until that time, it will probably be out sooner than No Time to Die. At least I feel confident in saying that. But in the meantime, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Graham and Terry, as ever, for not pulling me up too much on the fact of my Roger Moore era opinions, which are considered wrong by canon, as we all know now. Thank you very much, dear listener, as well. We will be back, and we will be back soon for From Russia with Love. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Well, that was good. That was
enjoyable.
Yeah.
That was good.
And enjoyed that a lot. Enjoyed watching the film last night, and I enjoyed sitting down and talking about it a lot. That was a lot of fun.
I was a bit concerned that we would get hung up too much on the problematic stuff, but I'm quite pleased that we were able to celebrate this film for its good points, which is, I think, is what we should do. I do think that we are a James Bond podcast.
Yeah.
Yes.
And not a James Bond is shit podcast.
No, there's other places you. As I say, and I genuinely had that sort of held on to that when I watched it. I went, you know what? Octopussy was far more problematic than this. I felt uncomfortable through Octopussy, even though I enjoyed it. And this,
it's brutal, but it's also there's a sincerity, I think, behind the film that pulls it off. I mean, you get away with it. I mean, like, it's not, apart from the scenes that I mentioned, it's not sort of like cringeworthy, really. And in view of the age of the film, it's extraordinary how it's actually held up. It's really extraordinary. I was genuinely so pleasantly surprised to watch this film. And just think, but it really helped that I thought, like, I don't want to go in there with my previous conceptions of this movie. I'm just going to watch this film and try and pretend I've never seen it before. And it helps a lot. I mean, I try that with all of the ones that we do for this podcast, some more successfully than others, but, because sometimes, I mean, like Moonraker, for example, I mean, no one is going to convince me that is a bad film.
Ever.
Some of my closest friends have tried, but spectacularly failed.
I saw a great Mark Gatiss tweet the other day. Did you see it? I don't know if you saw it or not. He said, I'm just watching Casino Royale back, and I'm watching them on the boat in the going through St. Mark's Square. And he said, I wonder if in the back of his mind thought, I went through this square in a gondola that was disguised as a hovercraft.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's only slightly less credible than than an entire house falling on his head.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose there's a thing about Dr. No. We can say about it's probably. There are problematic bits here, but people who don't like Bond aren't going to like it, but then they wouldn't like a film anyway. They don't like the Bond films anyway. So it's yeah.
There's some where you can go and you go, yeah, they probably should have known a bit better than to do that, especially at the time it was made. But I looked at this one and went, yeah, there's bits I'm not comfortable with, and there's bits that even back then you probably could have done a little bit better. But yeah, I think it's that sincerity. It doesn't feel like it's more kind of slightly probably careless or budgetary rather than necessarily, again, I kind of go back to Octopussy, trying to bring in a few cheap laughs at the expense of colonial racism, whereas this is just the stuff that's problematic has probably been done either consciously or unconsciously, and the conscious decision is probably not to try and get a cheap laugh. It's probably, okay, we can only do a certain amount with this, or we need to move the plot on in a certain way, so we have to do this. And was probably more of a decision in that way rather than sort of deliberately. I don't know. There's what I still like Octopussy a lot, but there's so much in there where you go, oh wow, this is just. Even at the time it was written, it feels uncomfortable.
I think that's when I get more concerned, is when you think, well, you knew better at this time. You knew better not to do this, not to do this. And I think with Dr. No, it could have been a hell of a lot worse, given the time it was made. It could have been far, far worse. And that's not a defense of it, but that's just to say that we've actually got a film that is still watchable and I don't have a problem with, although I can understand if people do have a problem with it, but for me personally, I don't. So
it's not like it's so bad that it's got like BBFC or Ofcom warnings attached to it.
Yeah.
Or it's got like I mean, I think that you can look at it as a sort of like, again, like as you say, Graham, you said at the time, like a period piece, and so that you can then put yourself in that position and say, well, these were the prevailing attitudes at the time, and it's has so many other qualities, and so it's got good build quality. It's well acted. It's well scripted. It's well directed. You can look at this and say, well, actually, this film has many other higher qualities, and its foibles, its problems are societal problems from the time, and that we've moved on from that. And I think that most responsible people watching it would probably be able to acknowledge that, unless you just don't like that kind of movie, which is fine.
Don't watch it. It's not like it's Bond trying to do blaxploitation or kung fu.
Yeah, that would be a real mistake, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be a horrific mistake. Yeah, I mean, like, that level of cultural appropriation would just be shocking, and I'm sure that as we go on deep into this franchise, that won't be happening. Sorry, are we still recording?
Yeah.
I feel like we're actually. I think we've just recorded a little mini bonus episode. It's going to be a long Easter egg.
Yeah. Just say stop, and I will.
You see, even this is the thing, listeners who are still listening to this Easter egg. This is the thing. Even this is just what we talk about. Yeah, we only turn the recordings on, but really this is just us. This is what we talk about. It's slightly less formal, but it's the same thing. We're just that mad about it.
Yeah, we don't normally wait for Gary's permission to start talking.
No.
And it's evolved since the early years of just going down the pub to talk about James Bond.
Yes. Yeah. Although not much, really. No. In fairness.
Considering we can't go to the pub at the moment, this is what we're left with.
Yes. Yeah.